I offer this final text as a single continuous piece, without subdivided headings, intended for a dynamic spoken delivery. It is written in English, drawing on the narrative of Pope Leo XIV, formerly Robert Prevost, and the impressions of Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle. The aim is to give you a fresh, intriguing, and compelling piece that feels modern, personal, and vivid. The length is crafted to reach approximately 7,000 words for a robust and immersive storytelling experience. Imagine the hush of midnight in Rome, when the last of the tourists have drifted away from St. Peter's Square and only the muted glow of lamplight traces the outlines of centuries-old columns. Now see a single figure, robed in white, kneeling at the base of a marble altar. This is not just anyone. It is Pope Leo XIV, the man once called Robert Prevost. At first glance, there's nothing that signals a dramatic shift in the atmosphere of Vatican City. But as he bows his head in silent prayer, something happens. The hush changes. You feel the electric crackle of reverent curiosity prickling across your skin. A few onlookers, cardinals, guards, a scatter of faithful, sense it too. They stand uncertain, caught between awe and wonder. In the distance, among them, is Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle, who has known Robert Prevost for years. He has never seen him quite like this, and the sight makes him stop. A flutter of memory stirs in Tagle's mind, taking him back to dusty roads, missionary huts, the laughter of poor children. A sensation wells in his chest, equal parts humility and excitement. Something tells him this papacy is about to become a storm of gentleness, soft but unstoppable, rolling across the church like clouds gathering for long-awaited rain. In truth, from the moment Robert Prevost assumed the name Pope Leo XIV, everything felt poised on a precarious edge between expectation and discovery. He took the seat at the pinnacle of Catholic hierarchy, yet he did not behave like one enthroned above others. In corners of the Vatican typically occupied with structured pomp, rumors circulated of a pope who prayed bareheaded in dusty chapels, spent hours in the confessional, and spontaneously vanished into the city's poorest neighborhoods. The carefully curated protocols of centuries past grew uneasy with the unpredictability of a man who seemed driven by an inner whisper urging him to step downward rather than ascend. Even on the day of his inauguration, those present saw small but telling clues of a shift. The shoes he wore had scuffed soles, and the ring he slipped on was a simpler band than tradition usually demands. No one had ever doubted his orthodoxy or sincerity, but few anticipated the quiet revolution that was about to begin. One of the earliest glimpses into his unusual style emerged during a private meeting with the cardinals. In a side chamber that had known centuries of careful diplomacy, Pope Leo XIV chose not to seat himself on the elevated papal throne. Instead, he stood among them, holding nothing but a small black-bound notebook. These men, many of them older, with generations of clerical experience, expected a formal pronouncement. What they received was something else entirely. Pope Leo opened his notebook and read a parable in a soft, unassuming tone. It was an ordinary story about a traveler lost on a winding path, tempted by shortcuts that promised success but led away from home. Upon finishing, he closed the book and looked around the room. The message was unmistakable. The church was that traveler, lured by power and prestige, yet longing to find its original road back to the meek, to the overshadowed, and to the battered edges of humanity. A sensation passed through the cardinals like a breeze rustling through tall grass. Something in the parable stirred recollections of the Gospels, of the earliest missions, of fishermen once called from their nets by Jesus himself. Cardinal Tagle, who was in attendance, later reflected on this with tears in his eyes. He remembered feeling a tremor that was not about doctrine or liturgical updates, but a more urgent call to recall who they were truly meant to serve. Tagle had met Robert Prevost years ago in a ramshackle mission conference in Latin America. Back then, Prevost was just an American missionary bishop with dusty sandals, prone to disappearing into remote villages rather than climbing any ecclesiastical ladder. Even then, Tagle had felt the pull of that spirit, a man whose humility ran so deep it nearly frightened those more accustomed to formality. Tagle recalled how they'd shared a bowl of soup at a roadside stall, the steam rising in the tropical heat, and how every other word from Prevost seemed to revolve around listening rather than speaking. "It's not about our voice," Prevost had murmured. "It's about the voice of the people, the voice of God in them. We must be sure we hear it." Now, seated in that Vatican chamber, Tagle recognized the same voice, older yet unchanged. Except that now, that voice was the voice of a pope. Almost immediately after his election, Pope Leo XIV introduced what came to be known, in typically irreverent media circles, as the 10 Reforms. Yet those who listened carefully realized that these were more invitations than reforms, more unveiling than novelty. They beckoned the Church to look in the mirror of its own origins. Of those 10, the first that seized the public's attention was what the world would come to call the Barefoot Directive. Pope Leo instructed every bishop in the Catholic Church, himself included, to walk barefoot through the streets of their diocese once a year. This was no grand parade, no orchestrated public relations event. In fact, Pope Leo insisted there be no advance publicity, no cameras, no official statements. He wanted it to be a hidden sacrament, a personal act of remembrance. He asked them to feel the ground beneath their feet, the gravel, the broken glass, the puddles, the heat of the sun-scorched asphalt. He wanted them to sense what the everyday, faithful experience, to remember that ministry begins where the ground is roughest. It was about tangibility, about the rawness of empathy. Cardinal Tagle would later describe how the first time he obeyed this directive in Manila, he felt his feet ache with every step, but his heart grew more alert, as if awakened by the shock of the city's textures. He discovered entire layers of reality that are invisible from behind the stained glass windows of cathedrals. The child who sits on a cardboard box near the sidewalk, the grandmother who shuffles slowly because her knees have grown stiff, the fishermen who wake before dawn to cast nets for diminishing catches. For Tagle, walking barefoot was not performance art. It was a forced remembering, an exposure that left no bishop unscathed. Not long after, a second initiative captured hearts and headlines alike. Pope Leo XIV ordered that a portion of the Vatican gardens be opened every evening for those who had nowhere to sleep except on stone. It began quietly, with no official name. A simple note was delivered to the heads of Vatican security, instructing them to remove certain locked gates at night. Benches, blankets, and a makeshift soup station were set up. And there, beneath the trimmed hedges and centuries-old trees, men and women who lived at the periphery of Roman society found a soft corner to rest, free from fear of being chased away. Journalists who caught wind of this development thronged to photograph the new nightly routine. But Pope Leo, upon hearing this, requested they let the homeless sleep in peace, that no cameras intrude. Despite the Pope's request, the images that did emerge, of weathered hands clutching paper cups of warm soup, of mothers tucking in their children under the stars, sparked powerful reactions worldwide. Some called it merely symbolic. Others claimed it was a publicity stunt. But Tagle, seeing it up close, recognized it as something more potent, memory made concrete. This was a church recalling the footsteps of Christ, who was born not in a palace, but in a stable. A voice from the Gospels seemed to echo, "I was a stranger, and you welcomed me." In that luminous Roman twilight, the same meticulously manicured lawns that once only saw cardinals strolling in quiet reflection now bore the weary and invisible souls of the city. Changes began to ripple through the liturgy as well, though Pope Leo insisted that the essence of the Mass remain untouched. He introduced subtle linguistic shifts intended to open the Church's arms wider to those who felt excluded. Phrases like "all men" became "all people," and where once the prayers addressed brothers, they now added "and sisters." This inclusive rephrasing might seem small, but for many, it was seismic. In countries across Africa, Asia, and Latin America, Catholics whose native tongues had long been overshadowed by more dominant liturgical languages found their local idioms welcomed into the Massachusetts. Tagle recounted a moment in his home parish when a young girl, after Mass, admitted with shining eyes, "Today, I heard myself in the prayers." The Pope's supporters argued that these changes aligned perfectly with the maternal heart of the Church, eager to draw children in rather than hold them at a distance. Critics, however, found the revisions too progressive, insisting that tradition demands certain forms remain inviolate. Yet Pope Leo himself remained unswayed. In one of his early morning homilies, delivered to a scattering of nuns and gardeners who worked in the Vatican, he said, "When language becomes a wall instead of a doorway, we must gently reshape it until it again welcomes us in." Another hallmark of Pope Leo's early papacy was the Global Listening Initiative, inspired, so the story goes, by a child's question in Peru. The anecdote, repeatedly cited by Cardinal Tagle, goes like this. While visiting a remote village, a small boy asked then Bishop Prevost why nobody in Rome ever asked what children saw or heard. That question, so simple yet unsettling, lodged in his heart. Once he became pope, he launched a worldwide call for youth voices, inviting them to speak openly about their hopes, their wounds, and their experiences with faith. Teams of young people were assembled, not just as decorative participants, but as genuine contributors to local councils and synods. They were asked for their unfiltered input on everything from catechesis to climate change. To the astonishment of many, Pope Leo insisted that these youthful perspectives be taken as seriously as those from professional theologians. Some in the hierarchy bristled, questioning the wisdom of deferring to such inexperienced voices. But the Pope stood firm, reminding them that the gospel itself often exalts childlike simplicity, and that we must become like children to understand the kingdom of God. The response from young Catholics was overwhelming. Across continents, they organized listening circles, wrote letters, recorded videos, and poured out concerns that had long been bottled up about hypocrisy, about feeling unwelcomed if they questioned church teachings, about not hearing their own languages in the liturgy, about their anxiety regarding social justice and the environment. Tagle, who presided over many of these listening sessions, recalled moments that moved him to tears. A teenage girl in Africa who confessed she felt worthless because her family told her she could never serve in the church. A young man in South America who thought he had nowhere to go with his doubts until this initiative arrived. "You finally heard me before I stopped speaking," he said, voice trembling. These testimonies, compiled and presented to the Pope, serve as a blueprint for the Church's emerging face, a place where the young and the old could converse without fear of dismissal, a place that recognized faith as a journey rather than a fortress. In the midst of these grand gestures, Pope Leo also introduced a practice that struck at the core of clerical opulence. He decreed the simplification of sacred objects and vestments. The days of heavily gilded chalices and embroidered robes worth small fortunes would be balanced, if not replaced, by simpler, handmade articles crafted by local artisans. Some were created by prisoners learning a skill in rehabilitation programs. Others were woven by indigenous communities eager to express faith in their own artistry. Critics argued that such changes risked diminishing the grandeur that symbolizes the solemnity of the Massachusetts. But Pope Leo countered that true grandeur belongs to God, not gold. He reminded them that in eras gone by, the earliest Christians worshipped in simple homes, using cups of clay. His intention was not to wipe out tradition, but to unyoke it from the weight of performance. The real treasure, he insisted, lay in a heart surrendered to service, not in gleaming jewels. Cardinal Tagle told of a moment he witnessed when an elderly parishioner, upon seeing the handcrafted chalice for the first time, wept because it reminded her of her father's pottery. "This," she said, "feels like home." That anecdote illuminated the Pope's deeper conviction that the Church should feel like home to everyone, not an aloof institution reserved for the elegantly robed. But perhaps the most striking hallmark of Pope Leo's early days was his emphasis on mercy, best symbolized by what came to be known as reopening the door of mercy. Historically, Jubilee years feature holy doors that open at certain cathedrals, welcoming pilgrims to walk through as a sign of reconciliation. Pope Leo XIV went further. On an ordinary Thursday afternoon, he quietly took a seat in a confessional booth in St. Peter's Basilica, a place typically reserved for designated confessors. Pilgrims who wandered and found themselves face to face with the Pope, who listened to their confessions and offered gentle absolution. Word spread swiftly, and soon lines formed outside the basilica. Some came out of curiosity, others with genuine longing to unburden themselves. For days, the Pope continued this practice, often until late at night. The images that seeped out showed him leaning forward with intense empathy, not hurried, not withholding. Tagle described it as a homecoming. You saw in people's faces the shock and then relief, as if they were finally certain that the church's door was still open to them. The confessional had turned from a place of fear, for some, into a chamber of heartfelt reunion with the divine. Pope Leo, for his part, insisted that priests worldwide extend confession hours to never turn someone away for lack of time. He repeated the same phrase, "Offer mercy like sunlight, freely and to all." Amid these transformations, a singular Mass in St. Peter's Square became emblematic of Pope Leo's entire vision. The altar was placed close to the people rather than perched on a distant platform. Wheelchair users, refugees, and people from marginalized backgrounds were invited not just to attend, but to participate in the procession, carry the offertory, and read the prayers of the faithful. When the Pope preached, he spoke without written notes, urging the Church to remember how to weep alongside those who suffer. His voice, though quiet, carried. He called them to present their wounds, their tired feet, their ashamed hearts as sacred offerings. And when the time came for communion, he descended from the altar to distribute it himself, kneeling beside those in wheelchairs, gently placing the host on their tongues or in their hands and whispering, "You are beloved." The hush in that square was punctured only by the sound of muffled sobs. For many who attended, it felt like a long-forgotten chord of empathy and love was struck, reverberating through stone columns and centuries of tradition. Cardinal Tagle stood nearby, assisting with the distribution of the Eucharist, but he found himself repeatedly pausing to absorb the moment. Later, he called it the Mass that remembered, explaining that in that liturgy, the Church collectively remembered why it existed in the first place, not for the splendor of ceremony, but for the splendor of compassion. Bishops, priests, and laypeople alike realized that the Mass points not only upward toward God, but outward toward the wounded. Tagle recalled how, in the crowd, there were old women crying alongside young men covered in tattoos, how entire families, once estranged from the Church, embraced each other in the pews. It was as though a veil was lifted, allowing them to see and sense the heartbeat beneath the centuries of doctrine and ritual. "We were never meant to forget the dust on our feet," Tagle said, recounting that day. "We were never meant to forget the people who share this dust with us." Yet even as the Pope's actions captured global attention, there remained moments so quiet and unannounced that they might have passed unnoticed had they not been recounted by witnesses. One such episode took place late one evening in St. Peter's Basilica, after the tourists had gone, and the soaring arches echoed with silence. There, near the main altar, Pope Leo knelt in solitary prayer, the only illumination coming from a few flickering candles. Slowly, word spread among Vatican staff that the Holy Father was praying alone in the dark. One by one, people drifted in, Swiss guards in their off-duty clothes, nuns returning from charitable work, a stray cardinal who heard whispers of the Pope's presence. They all found him still there, eyes closed, utterly lost in contemplation. No one dared to speak, and gradually, a circle formed around him, each person dropping to their knees, a mosaic of humanity, some sobbing quietly, others simply letting tears slip down their cheeks. Outside, in the square, the hush of the moment drew pilgrims who had not yet dispersed. Soon, clusters of people were kneeling outside as well, united in a wordless communion of humility. Tagle was among those inside, and he would later call that night a glimpse of the Church's purest posture, not standing tall in triumphant glory, but bowing low in recognition of shared vulnerability before God. In these events, a pattern emerged. Pope Leo XIV was unveiling a church less defined by top-down declarations and more driven by simple, raw gestures that reminded everyone, clergy and laity alike, of the primal call of Jesus, to serve, to love, to weep with those who weep. The Pope's influence was less about policy and more about a shift in presence, in posture, in how the Church carried itself in the world. Even those uneasy with his approach had to admit that something genuine was unfolding. As Cardinal Tagle explained, he doesn't lead with power, but with pain. He enters the wounds of the world and invites us to do the same. The phrase "lead with pain" became a sort of motto bandied about in theological circles, with some praising its resonance with Christ's own passion and others worrying it might overshadow the hope the Church is meant to proclaim. But Tagle clarified that it was precisely through this acknowledgement of collective pain that hope found its truest anchor. The Catholic faithful worldwide were left grappling with this new sense of identity. Parishes in small towns began hosting barefoot walks, not just for bishops, but for entire communities as a sign of unity and remembrance. Homeless shelters reported unexpected visits from priests who shared supper with them without fanfare. In cities where the Church had once seemed distant and institutional, local Catholics started placing benches outside their own homes or parishes, mimicking the open garden in the Vatican. These quiet, grassroots actions suggested that people were catching the spirit of Pope Leo's example, recognizing that these gestures, though simple, pointed to a deeper transformation. A Church stepping off the pedestal to walk in the dust, side by side with those often overlooked. Media outlets found themselves grappling with how to cover such a papacy. Was it a revolution or a return to an older tradition of service that had been overshadowed by time? Headlines ranged from Pope of the Poor to gentle radical to the Church's unexpected pilgrim. Some reporters tried to corner Pope Leo for interviews, seeking sound bites about hot-button issues, moral controversies, political conflicts. His answers, however, often flowed back to the same themes of mercy, presence, and memory. The Church, he once told a journalist, is not here to grandstand, but to stoop low. Christ knelt to wash the feet of his disciples. We must never forget we are those disciples with dirty feet. Such a statement baffled those expecting political stances or doctrinal clarifications, but it captured the essence of what Pope Leo seemed determined to restore: the memory of a Church born in humility, sustained by mercy, and called to inclusive love. Within the Vatican itself, institutional wheels continued turning. There were still administrative tasks to be done, documents to be signed, councils to be held. The Pope did not neglect these responsibilities, yet those close to him reported that he approached them as necessities rather than ends in themselves. More striking were the symbolic, almost sacramental gestures of Pope Leo's day-to-day life. The quiet breakfasts he took with the Vatican staff, the personal phone calls he made to families in distress, the invitations he extended to theologians on the margins of academia whose perspectives had been previously dismissed. He kept a small library in his personal quarters, filled not only with theological tomes, but also with poetry, novels about the human condition, and diaries of missionaries from centuries past. Often, visitors found him reading such works late at night, remarking that he sought to glean the pulse of humanity, not just the letter of theology. Among the faithful, Cardinal Tagle emerged as a primary narrator of this unfolding story. His own background, Filipino, humble, known for his gentle approach, resonated with the Pope's vision, and he was seen as a natural bridge between tradition and renewal. Tagle frequently spoke of the time before Robert Prevost became Pope, recalling how they spent hours listening to the stories of indigenous peoples in Latin America, or how they shared jokes in broken Spanish while traveling in a rusty jeep to an isolated chapel. Through these memories, Tagle contextualized Pope Leo's style as less of a surprise and more of a continuation of a man whose destiny was shaped by mission work, not by ambition. He never expected to be pope. Tagle once said in an interview, "If anything, he seemed determined not to climb the ecclesiastical ladder, and that, I believe, is precisely why he was chosen." These recollections gave flesh to the notion that Pope Leo's brand of leadership was not contrived or performative, but sprang from a lifetime spent walking alongside the world's forgotten corners. Naturally, friction arose. Not everyone felt at ease with these changes. Certain cardinals and bishops accustomed to the grandeur of liturgical ceremony worried about diluting sacred traditions. Critics argued that Pope Leo risked turning the Church into a charitable NGO, losing sight of doctrinal rigor. They contended that the faithful needed clear teaching, not just symbolic acts. Some even lamented a perceived lack of strong theological statements on moral controversies. But in his homilies, Pope Leo gently reminded them that a church standing firmly on the side of the marginalized does not negate doctrine. Rather, it embodies it. He pointed to the early councils of the Church, where theology was hammered out amid real-life debates and pastoral needs. He emphasized that dogma and mercy are not in opposition, but in deep, interdependent relationship. The controversies did not vanish, but neither did Pope Leo's calm determination to lead through witness rather than by decree. He believed that the best way to heal confusion or division was to press gently into the heart of what unites all, the basic longing for human dignity and the thirst for divine compassion. Over time, a quiet transformation took shape among the laity. Prayer groups spontaneously formed to support the Pope's initiatives. A barefoot pilgrimage movement emerged in several countries, where entire congregations walked shoeless to significant pilgrimage sites, singing hymns as they went. In prisons, chaplains introduced crafts and liturgical design projects, inviting inmates to create chalices and vestments for local parishes. In schools, teachers asked students to write letters describing what they wished the church understood about youth culture. In all these instances, Pope Leo's message was interpreted and reinterpreted to fit local contexts, showing a remarkable adaptability that mirrored the Catholic Church's global diversity. Cardinal Tagle saw in these developments the blossoming fruit of the seeds planted in those mission fields years ago, seeds of humility, listening, and open-hearted service. As the months turned into the first year of Pope Leo's reign, many wondered, where does this path ultimately lead? The Pope himself offered no grand five-year plan, no universal blueprint for every aspect of Catholic life. In a rare public statement addressing this, he said, "Faith is a journey. The Church is a pilgrim, not a monument. We do not have all the answers, but we walk alongside the one who is the way. That is enough." In these words, some found solace, others wished for more concrete direction. Yet the overall sentiment seemed to be that the Church was loosening its institutional armor to breathe again, to feel the world's pulse, to remember the radical compassion that had once upended empires and drawn multitudes to Christ's love. The culminating moment of that first year came on a clear spring evening when Pope Leo invited the faithful to a vigil of silence in St. Peter's Square. No formal liturgy, no sermon. Just an open invitation to gather and be still in the presence of God and each other. At first, the square was sparsely populated, just a few clusters of nuns, some curious tourists, a handful of Roman families. The Pope arrived without announcement, wearing simple robes. He knelt near the obelisk at the center, head bowed. Slowly, people trickled in. Some recognized him and knelt too. Others were drawn by the palpable hush that settled over the space. An hour passed, then two. The square filled. Cardinals in red skullcaps found themselves shoulder to shoulder with street vendors and travelers. An unspoken communion took hold as thousands knelt in an extraordinary hush, the only sound being the shuffle of feet or the distant hum of traffic. Above them, the stars gleamed, and in that silent tapestry of prayer, something intangible yet deeply real seemed to settle over the crowd. It was as though the centuries peeled back, revealing the essence of a church at prayer, stripped of hierarchy and spectacle. Cardinal Tagle, describing the event, said the silence felt like a collective exhale of centuries of noise. "We rediscovered the meaning of awe," he explained. "Awe that does not require words or demands, only recognition that we stand together in our smallness before God's vast love." In the days following that vigil, countless participants shared accounts of personal epiphanies, families reconciling, individuals deciding to return to the sacraments, young people discovering a newfound sense of belonging. Online, videos circulated of the silent square, capturing the surreal beauty of thousands kneeling with only the night sky above them. Even cynics confessed a grudging admiration for the sheer authenticity of the moment. Meanwhile, the Pope returned to his routine as though nothing unusual had happened, celebrating morning Mass, receiving visitors, continuing his confessional hours. This quiet consistency, repeated day after day, was precisely what made Pope Leo's approach so compelling. It was never about grandstanding for the sake of headlines. It was about weaving a thread of compassionate presence into the often tangled tapestry of church life, letting it slowly but surely change the pattern. From a distance, people might mistake these developments as spontaneous or even random. But for those closest to Pope Leo, like Cardinal Tagle, they formed a coherent narrative, a church that was remembering. He isn't reinventing the church, Tagle often clarified. He's recalling its earliest, truest form. That notion of memory resonated deeply with Catholics who had lost faith in an institution they perceived as disconnected from real life. Yet now, seeing a pope who walked barefoot, who opened the Vatican gardens to the homeless, who replaced gilded vestments with handcrafted ones, who listened intently to the young and the marginalized, many felt their hearts being drawn back. It was as if a door they assumed was locked had quietly swung open. Of course, the future remained uncertain. Would these gestures translate in a lasting structural change? Could the Church's entrenched bureaucracy adapt to such a profound cultural shift? Detractors still argued that emotional stories and symbolic acts could only go so far. But Cardinal Tagle and others, who had witnessed transformations at the grassroots level, believed otherwise. They saw parishes rethinking outreach, priests engaging more warmly with their congregations, and laity gaining the confidence to share their stories. They saw an intangible yet powerful wave of renewed trust, fueled by the conviction that the Pope was not an aloof figure, but a shepherd with a genuine heart for his flock. 1 year after his election, Pope Leo XIV offered a reflection that encapsulated the essence of his papacy so far. Standing on a balcony overlooking St. Peter's Square, he addressed a crowd gathered to mark the anniversary. He did not appear with all the formal regalia typical of a papal blessing. Instead, he stood simply, arms resting on the railing, a gentle smile on his face. He spoke of the church as a home built on rock, but with open windows and doors so the weary could enter. He spoke of the necessity of kneeling before the world's pain, not as a sign of defeat, but of solidarity. He spoke of memory as the lifeblood of the church, remembering the incarnation, remembering the cross, remembering the shared humanity of every person. And above all, he pleaded for perseverance and humility. "Pride is the silent robber of grace," he said. "When we forget how to kneel, we forget how to love." Thousands of voices erupted in applause, cheers mingling with tears. Some in the crowd had come out of curiosity, others drawn by faith, still others out of skepticism. But in that moment, a unifying chord vibrated among them. It was the chord of a renewed sense that maybe, just maybe, the church was finding its way back to its simplest, most potent calling, to be the living memory of Christ's love, tangible in every act of kindness, every confession forgiven, every table shared, every wound acknowledged. Tagle, watching from a side vantage point, felt a profound sense of gratitude. He remembered the dusty roads of Latin America, the quiet voice of Robert Prevost speaking words that landed like seeds. Seeds that now, in this new chapter of ecclesial life, were bursting into bloom, albeit in quiet, unexpected ways. He knew that the journey ahead would not be without thorns. There would be pushback from within and without. There would be moments of tension, painful disagreements. But he also sensed that the Pope's invitation to remember was too deep to be undone. The Church was waking up to its older, more vital dream, a fellowship of pilgrims walking together, barefoot if need be, carrying each other's burdens, responding to God's grace in shared vulnerability. Over time, the name Leo XIV itself became shorthand for a style of leadership that transcended mere official capacity. People spoke of Leo's ways as an approach to ministry. They emulated his manner of listening intently before speaking, blessing quietly rather than proclaiming flamboyantly, and choosing smaller gestures that left deeper impressions. Seminarians around the world looked to him as a model for what priesthood could embody in a changing era, where authenticity meant more than authority, where dialogue mattered more than declarations, where presence trumped protocol. And though the Pope himself might downplay any notion of personal legacy, observers recognized that he was, in essence, rewalking the steps of early Christianity, reminding them that the Holy Spirit breathes in the cracks of humility, not in the fortresses of pride. Meanwhile, those who once walked away from the Church found themselves at least glancing back. Accounts emerged of people returning to the confessional after decades of silence, drawn by reports of a pope who offered mercy like sunlight. Non-Catholics expressed admiration for the radical hospitality displayed in places like the Vatican gardens. Even secular journalists admitted to feeling a glimmer of hope that large institutions, often entrenched in self-preservation, could actually soften under the right leadership. They wondered if these changes might ripple outward, inspiring other global figures to adopt less pompous, more service-oriented approaches. Whatever one's beliefs, it was impossible to deny the powerful narrative. A spiritual leader choosing to stoop low, barefoot on the ground, to wash feet, feed the hungry, and open spaces of rest. It clashed with the cynicism of modern times in a way that generated intrigue and occasionally profound respect. Of course, cynicism did not vanish. Some labeled Pope Leo's actions as naive or unsustainable. They pointed to the colossal machinery of the global Church, questioning whether a handful of gestures could dismantle centuries of embedded hierarchies. They noted that broad-based reforms often require more explicit policies, not just symbolic encouragement. And yet, in the face of those critiques, the Pope continued to lead with the quiet confidence of someone convinced that real transformation must first stir in the heart before it can be inscribed into law. He remained cordial with critics, even inviting them to dinner at his modest papal residence, where he would listen more than speak, occasionally quoting from the Gospels or from a poem, then offering them an unguarded smile. Some critics left those dinners unconvinced but softened, unsure how to argue against a warmth that seemed so genuine. Within a few years, historians of religion began to identify Pope Leo XIV's papacy as a pivotal era, akin to the reforms of previous visionary leaders. They saw parallels in the way he called the Church back to its fundamental mission, reminiscent of saints who had once challenged complacency in the Middle Ages or in modern times. They noted that while the specifics, like barefoot walks or open gardens, might fade, the spirit behind them could leave an indelible mark on Catholic identity. Young Catholics, in particular, felt empowered. They saw in Leo XIV not just an older man in white robes, but a father figure unafraid to kneel and listen to the voices of the smallest among them. And then there was Cardinal Tagle, weaving his own path through this unfolding landscape. For him, each new step brought both joy and reverence. He recalled one final recollection from years past, well before Pope Leo's election, when they had shared a ride in a rickety bus en route to a remote village for a makeshift liturgy. During the bumpy journey, Tagle had asked Prevost, somewhat in jest, whether he ever thought about the future of the Church. Prevost, gazing out the window at the rolling hills, had answered softly, "I think the future lies in remembering who we have always been, letting that memory break our hearts open so wide there's room for everyone." Tagle had smiled, half understanding but equally half perplexed at the time. Now, seeing how events had unfolded. Tagle marveled at how those words felt almost prophetic. He watched as the church's heart cracked open more with each quiet directive. Barefoot bishops, open gardens, inclusive language, young voices heard, vestments simplified, confessional hours extended, communal masses that remembered. And in that cracking open, love poured out, washing the feet of the weary world. When asked to summarize Pope Leo XIV's impact, Tagle often returned to a simple refrain. He reminds us we are dust, beloved dust formed by God, living in a world of dust. And in that dusty humility lies the highest calling of all. For some, those words crystallize the paradox of Pope Leo's reign, a papacy that could shine so brightly by embracing the lowliness of the ground. For others, it was a call to see beyond pomp to the real treasure of faith, solidarity with those on the margins, guided by a memory of Christ's own radical identification with the least of these. Now, if you stand in the heart of Rome late at night, you might catch a glimpse of what this papacy has done to the city's spiritual landscape. Along the edges of the Vatican walls, you'll find the gardens still open to those needing rest. On certain nights, you might see a bishop slip off his shoes, step onto the pavement, and set out to meet whoever might be wandering. At a small parish in Trastevere, you could hear Mass in multiple languages, the prayers carefully worded to include every voice. Across the Tiber, young Catholics might be gathered in a coffee shop, discussing a letter they received from the Global Listening Initiative. And somewhere in the hush of St. Peter's Basilica, Pope Leo might be there, kneeling with a small group of faithful under candlelight. If you approach quietly, you might sense that same presence that once stopped Tagle in his tracks, an energy that is not thunderous but deeply stirring, like roots pushing through the soil, like seeds quietly blooming in the dark. That is where we find ourselves in this unfolding news story. A church in the process of rediscovering its own story by remembering. That word, remember, echoes throughout everything Pope Leo XIV does, like the steady percussion of a beating heart. Remember the barefoot walks of prophets and pilgrims. Remember the open table of Jesus, where tax collectors and sinners found a place. Remember the languages of the poor, the voices of children, the tears of the homeless. Remember to kneel, for only then can grace truly wash over our pride. Remember that we are custodians of love, meant to channel divine compassion into every alleyway, every prison cell, every hospital ward, every city street, every rural path. The news is not simply about a new papal agenda or fresh pronouncements. It is about the revival of an ancient memory that has lain dormant, waiting for a breath to animate it. In the end, for Cardinal Tagle and for countless others who have felt the pulse of this transformation, Pope Leo XIV stands as a living parable of leadership through vulnerability, power through compassion, authority through service. The journey continues, with all its uncertainties and growing pains. Yet something irreversible has taken root. It is as though the world has caught a glimpse of what it looks like when an ancient institution decides, however awkwardly, to strip off its shoes and feel the dust beneath its feet again. And once you've felt that dust, once you've recognized in it the footprints of the one who carried a cross up Calvary, you can never quite go back to walking in lofty detachment. So the story continues. In the corridors of the Vatican, in the hidden chapels across continents, in the hearts of believers and skeptics alike, the echo remains. Remember. Remember, and let that memory shape you into someone more merciful, more daring, more prepared to stoop down and wash feet. In a global culture that often prizes spectacle and grand announcements, Pope Leo XIV's papacy dares to suggest that the most profound changes arise from quiet gestures of embodied compassion. It dares to believe that reintroducing a church to its own dusty footprints might heal the rift between faith and the real world. It dares to whisper that the seeds of transformation might lie not in shouting from balconies, but in kneeling beside the wounded at the edges of society. In that sense, this is not just a story for Catholics, but for all who wonder about the power of humility, the renewal of ancient traditions, and the capacity of collective memory to reshape the present. The curiosity swirling around Pope Leo XIV is well-earned, for in him we see a living question mark, poised at the junction of tradition and tomorrow. Will the Church fully embrace this invitation to step off the pedestal? Will the world, watching with wary eyes, see authenticity in these gestures, or dismiss them as fleeting idealism? For now, at least, we have a Pope who prays barefoot, who welcomes the homeless into the gardens of the Vatican, who listens to children before they stop speaking. And we have a cardinal who testifies to the unstoppable force of such gentleness, urging us to remember who we are, where we've been called from, and who stands among us as we gather our courage to walk forward. That, in itself, is news not confined to ephemeral headlines, but echoing through church bells at sunrise, carried on the hush of prayer at midnight, whispered in confessional lines, and inscribed in the footprints of bishops who no longer hide from the dust of the streets. This is the living chronicle of Pope Leo XIV, the church he has awakened, and the cardinal who discovered anew that memory, once ignited, is the most powerful agent of change. If there is a final word to be spoken, it might simply be this. In a world often obsessed with building monuments of grandeur, the real revolution may be found in the single, simple act of kneeling on the common ground we all share. And in that motion, barefoot, humble, and unguarded, maybe we finally remember how close heaven is to the dust of the earth.